Alright, what's up everybody, welcome back to some more Outriders gameplay. Today let's talk about the recent changes. Chances are that if you check the patch notes, if you saw some of the fixes, you're now all of a sudden feeling squishy. Maybe you're no longer capable of finishing a CT15, which was previously very easy and accessible for you and your build. Maybe you're getting one-shotted by enemies all of a sudden, or simply put, you're not surviving for as long as you did previously. Well, let's talk about that in this video, and more important, let's talk about the workarounds that so far that I've implemented worked very well for me, pretty much brought me back to how I was in the previous sub days. But I will also cover a very important subject about a certain stat a bit later on in the video and a possible fix from the developers. So let's jump right into it. Now let's get started with a big disclaimer and the reason why you're feeling so squishy, because for the entirety of the past month, pretty much every endgame build that was purely glass cannon was running with a mod that for the most part was broken. It was never ending, and once it activated, it continued to stay activated, which in this case is the emergency stance, the one that would activate the golem ability, which would give you a 65% damage reduction across the board. This included both physical damage as well as anomaly damage and status effects. So this was broken, it was fixed, and this is the main reason why now you're getting destroyed in one hit, pretty much even by the smallest enemies in expeditions. So what does this mean right now for you? It's pretty simple. It means that we have to make up for that golem ability from the emergency stance, which means we have to make a 2 mod combination right here, and for certain builds it might be 3 mods, so we will have to sacrifice some of our maximum damage, which means you're no longer going to run a full glass cannon build anymore, at least not unless you want to clear CT15s anymore. So here are the 2 mods that I'm using right now. It's Mitigation from Death with Circle of Power. Why am I using Circle of Power as well? Well, let me give you an example really quickly. Mitigation from Death right now, which is what I assume most people will go with after the golem ability is fixed, is going to give you a lot of armor, essentially over 150k once you stack it up to 3 times, which means that for a max level character that has a default 50,000 armor, that means that they will easily reach the physical damage reduction cap of 85%. Maybe you're not like strictly 85%, maybe it's 82%, but with just that, with the mitigation of that, you're going to be really close to that maximum cap. Problem is that resistance is still 0, because armor for some reason has absolutely no effect over resistance, even though resistance is listed as a stat right beneath armor. So we're gonna talk about that at the end of this video, but armor does not affect resistance, which means you have to get it from somewhere else. Resistance is the main stat that will mitigate damage from anomaly attacks and status damage. This means any spell from the enemies. This also means any freeze effect, bleed or burn that is coming from one of your enemies. If it's 0%, it means that you're getting the full damage, which means that you might still get one-shotted from enemies that don't use physical attacks, which is what brings us to the Circle of Power. This is going to boost your resistance by 15% every time you use a skill, and it stacks up to 3 times. This means that you can get it up to a maximum of 45%, which means you can mitigate 45% of the incoming anomaly damage. It's still not the same as the 65% that the golem ability had, but it's the best one we have. It's one of the best at the very least that we have, and this is especially useful for any build that spams abilities in a short amount of time. In this case, the Trickster with the regular build is pretty much a perfect fit, because you're casting these abilities all the time. You have a very low cooldown, so essentially in combat you're always going to have a 45% resistance for that damage mitigation. It's going to be even easier for anomaly builds, for example, because you're going to spam abilities even more there, so it's even easier for those types of builds. But let's say you're running with a build that doesn't spam abilities. Maybe you're running with a Technomancer and you don't really cast that many abilities because your cooldowns are a little bit longer. Well, don't worry, there are a couple of options still in the game, but they aren't going to be perfect, so just be ready for that. One of them is Diffuse. Sprinting increases your armor by 42k, but it also increases your resistance by 50%. The problem here is that you have to be sprinting for that resistance 50% to activate, but you can actually do that. You're going to be sprinting on the map anyway, constantly trying to reposition yourself. It's something that I've tried with on the Technomancer, and yes, it absolutely works. It definitely helps it. Again, the moment you stop sprinting, you end those buffs and you have to sprint again to gain them back, but luckily there's no cooldown on them, so as long as you're sprinting you can activate these at your own leisure. Another one would be well, damage absorber, but this is something that I would mostly recommend for a build that is still leveling up on a, for example, a low level character or a character that is still progressing through CTs. It gives you some resistance, only 10%, but it gives you slightly more armor compared to Diffuse, which is 52k. It might be a little bit better, but you have to combine it with other means of getting more resistance. So in this case, maybe damage absorber and combine it with that tier 3 mod I was talking about with the circle of power to actually get up to 50%, or well, 55% in this case, resistance in total. You can also do that with a maximum build, by the way, and get it to 55. I'm just showing you that these are the mod combinations right here. Now, I will not talk about resistance right now. I still want to go over a mod combination. I will let that for just a little bit, but I want to talk about first a build for the Trickster that no longer works, which was Embalmer's Rage with Vein Ripper in combination with Vampiric Mag, which essentially you could apply bleeds on enemies because you were critting constantly because of Embalmer's Rage, and because you were applying bleeds constantly, you could make use of the Vampiric Mag to constantly, again, get those ammo replenished back. The problem is, it no longer works. For some reason, if you one-shot enemies, the game behaves as if you don't even apply the bleed in the first place, which means that you no longer get that ammo replenish at all, which means this build with the death shield right now on the Trickster, at least from what I've been able to test, no longer works. So until that gets fixed, that's gonna be the best build, by the way, for you, but until that gets fixed, you're going to want to run with something like the Bulwark with the ultimate bleeding bullets, or at least have some other way to apply bleeds onto the targets so that you can make use of that Vampiric magazine. From that point on, you're going to actually want to combine this with the Thirst for Blood so that you can increase your weapon leech. Again, I'm running in this case with a build that uses both leech as well as damage mitigation, and so far this is the one that worked the best for me. By the way, if you want to check the build, this is how it looks from top to bottom. These are all of the mods that I'm using right now. I didn't get the Yugake like cowl or whatever, so until you can get that to make up for the ammo replenish, this is what you're going to want to use for a Trickster that is freshly leveling up, or for a Trickster that is still in the leveling process or still pushing to CT 15. This is what has worked for me so far. Now, on a final note, I will address a big problem and concern that I have right now, which did not manifest itself over the past month because we were running with a broken mod, which was that golem ability from the emergency stance. And that is resistance. Now, we didn't talk about this because we didn't have to, but it's a problem that existed since the very beginning. Resistance, even though it is a stat that is directly underneath armor, does not get affected by it whatsoever. You can have 500k armor, 5 million armor, or 0 armor, your resistance will be 0 completely all the time. Now, yes, it is true that passive perks like immunity in the middle tree will provide resistance, but you have to spec as a tank in order to benefit from that, which means you are no longer capable of taking down enemies in a good amount of time. So my suggestion right here for the developers is to make armor to also benefit resistance, at least to a certain degree, similar to how physical damage is also affected. So let us have resistance increased by armor by a certain amount, like in the case of the physical damage it was 50%, and for the rest of it you could make up with mods to reach the 85% cap. Make something similar for the resistance as well, and make it in this case 10%, 15%, 20%, at least make it that, because right now the number of mods in the game that affect resistance are not enough. They are not nearly enough for you to even reach close to the maximum cap, at least not unless unless you also want to go into that middle skill tree, which is not viable because then it means you're not going to be able to finish with a golden timer. That or scale down the damage of enemies, otherwise you're going to risk with many of the builds in the game right now to not be viable anymore. In fact, this is one of the updates, this is the second update after the balance update we got like a few weeks back that further reduces build diversity in the end game and forces you with even more cookie clutter kind of builds. So this should be changed in the future. It also doesn't make sense for resistance to not be affected by armor, because just think about it, like if you wear armor on your character, in theory you should not be affected by a burn ability as much because you have a protecting layer on top. So even like from a real world point of view, it makes sense for resistance to also be affected by armor. Like you would probably make it fireproof, you would make that armor fireproof, right? So yeah, totally let me know down below what you think of these changes. Let me know what and how they have affected your class and your build, and how well are you faring in expeditions compared to the previous update. Again, it doesn't mean that everybody gets affected, just a number of builds are getting, but it's significant enough. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.